I remember the first moment with a clarity that unsettles me. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for years. Dust lingered in the air, suspended in thin beams of sunlight slicing through narrow cracks in the blinds. The hardwood floors creaked under my heels as I stepped into the living room, and that was when I saw it. The jagged crack running from the ceiling down the wall, thin at the top and wide at the base, like a wound splitting the skin of the house. It looked unnatural, raw, almost alive, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. For reasons I couldn't explain, it made me feel as though I was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I kept staring at that crack as if it might reveal something hidden. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to pulse with a rhythm that belonged to me. My stomach tightened, and I had the ridiculous thought that maybe the house wasn't broken at all, that maybe it was me. I raised my hand and traced the line in the air, not daring to touch the wall itself, feeling a strange pull, like gravity bending in the wrong direction. My pulse was faster than it should have been for such a small detail. It wasn't just a flaw in the plaster. It was a reminder that stability is fragile and anything can split open without warning. The silence pressed in on me as I moved farther into the space. Every step felt heavy, weighted by the air that clung to me like damp cloth. I ran my eyes over the rest of the room, the forgotten furniture pushed against the walls, the faint smell of mildew, the shadows gathering in the corners. Still, it was the crack that kept pulling me back. It was as if the house was whispering, showing me exactly where it had given up on holding itself together. I wondered if I had come here to look at the property, or if I had really come to confront something in myself. I had walked into dozens of houses before, empty shells waiting for someone to fill them with life. But this one felt different, heavier, as though it carried a memory that wasn't mine, but insisted on wrapping itself around me. The air seemed charged, not quite hostile, but not welcoming either. I stood in the center of the room and tilted my head back, following the crack upward, imagining it running beyond the ceiling, slicing through the sky, cutting open everything I thought was solid. I shivered, though the temperature was mild, and I pressed my palms together, grounding myself in the weight of my own body. There was an odd intimacy in being alone with a flaw so visible. Houses were supposed to present strength, order, safety. But here I was, face to face with something imperfect, vulnerable, something that betrayed the facade. I found myself strangely drawn to it, the way one might be drawn to staring at their own scar in the mirror. It wasn't beautiful, not in any traditional sense, but it held a kind of truth that I couldn't deny. In that moment, I felt more seen by this broken wall than I had in years of polished rooms and carefully arranged furniture. The longer I stood there, the more I felt as though the house and I were locked in some silent confession. I thought of the cracks in my own life, the fractures I never allowed anyone else to see, the arguments swallowed in silence, the loneliness buried beneath work, the longing I had folded neatly away like old clothes at the back of a drawer. This house mirrored it back at me, unflinching and unashamed. It dared me to look, dared me to admit that I was not as seamless as I pretended to be. I wanted to turn away, to dismiss the feeling as nothing more than the strangeness of an abandoned space, but I couldn't. My body rooted itself in place, every muscle resisting the idea of moving on to the next room. My gaze returned again and again to that imperfect line, as if it were the start of a story that I wasn't ready to hear but couldn't avoid. My heartbeat filled the silence, loud and insistent, like a drum echoing off empty walls. For the first time in years, I felt the sharp edge of possibility, unsettling and magnetic, pressing against the surface of my carefully managed life. I told myself it was only a crack, only plaster and paint surrendering to time. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't. It was something else entirely. It was a door disguised as damage, an invitation I didn't yet understand, a reminder that once something breaks, it can never go back to what it was before. And somehow, standing in that silent house, staring at that crooked line, I realized I was waiting for something, or someone, to step into that fracture and show me what it meant. When I reached the top of the stairs, the air shifted as if I had crossed an invisible threshold. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and dim, with doors leading into rooms that seemed to be holding their breath. My steps were careful, the wood groaning beneath me, each sound amplified by the silence. I paused at the doorway of the master bedroom, hand resting against the frame, as though I needed permission to enter. The moment I stepped inside, the air became heavier, thick, with something I couldn't quite name. It clung to my skin, filled my lungs, and pressed against my ribs until even my heartbeat felt altered. The bedroom was larger than I expected, though the size only added to the sense of exposure. Light filtered weakly through curtains that hadn't been moved in years, and the dust that hung in the shafts of sun seemed golden and unsettling at once. In the center of the room stood the bed, wide and low, its cover faded into an indeterminate color between cream and gray. It was ordinary, yet my eyes kept returning to it as if it held more than fabric and springs. The air around it seemed different, as though every movement, every breath became heavier in its presence. I could almost imagine the weight of bodies that once pressed into those sheets, the imprint of lives lived and secrets kept. I walked slowly across the room, each step measured, deliberate. The floor groaned beneath me, and the sound echoed louder than it should have, like a warning or a call. My gaze drifted to the tall mirror mounted above the dresser, its surface cloudy with age. When I caught sight of my reflection, I flinched at how stark I looked, an outline against the dim light, blurred but undeniable. For a moment, I felt as if the mirror wasn't only reflecting me, but also holding something else, something that watched silently from the background. I moved closer, my breath fogging the glass, until I almost expected to see another shape standing beside me. The windows drew my attention next. They were wide, framed by long curtains that dragged across the floor. When I pulled them slightly apart, sunlight streamed in, illuminating motes of dust that swirled like a galaxy around me. The sudden brightness didn't lighten the room. It only sharpened the edges of everything, making the bed seem more intrusive, the mirror more watchful, the silence more oppressive. The curtains fell back into place with a heavy swish, and the dimness returned, almost like a sigh of relief from the house itself. The atmosphere wrapped itself around me again, denser now, pressing into my skin. I sat briefly on the edge of the bed, though I didn't mean to. The mattress gave way with a soft sigh, and the feeling of sinking into it startled me. My hands rested on the cover, rough beneath my fingertips, textured with years of use. I tried to imagine who had last sat here, who had last laid their head against the pillows. That thought lingered longer than I wanted it to, sending an unexpected warmth through me, unsettling and confusing. It was as if the bed carried a memory that seeped into me the moment I touched it. I lay back for just a moment, though even that felt like transgression. The ceiling above loomed, the faint pattern of cracks spreading outward like veins. The stillness of the room seemed to grow louder, filling my ears with a hum that wasn't really there. I let my eyes drift to the mirror again from where I reclined, and the sight of myself lying on that bed made my chest tighten. There was something indecent in the image, something unspoken that lingered in the space between observation and desire. I turned my head away quickly, but the impression remained. As I stood, the air grew warmer, heavier still. My body felt sluggish, as though each movement was slowed by an unseen hand. I brushed my palms against my thighs, grounding myself in the friction, trying to shake off the sensation. But the truth was clear. The room was alive with a presence I could not name. The master bedroom was no ordinary space. It was charged, intimate, suffocating, and intoxicating all at once. Every detail, from the creak of the floorboards to the weight of the curtains, seemed to pull me deeper into a silence I could not resist. I left the room reluctantly, though I told myself it was only to breathe easier. As I crossed the threshold, I glanced back once more. The bed sat still in the half-light, the mirror catching only fragments of my shape as I slipped out. For reasons I didn't yet understand, I knew this room would not let me go. It had already carved its impression into me, and I could feel its weight following me, pressing down with every step away from it. The evening unfolded with a strange slowness, as if time had been stretched thin across the walls. The house felt quieter than it had during the day, and yet every creak and shift of wood seemed sharper, heavier, charged with something invisible. I returned to the master bedroom without even questioning why, as though my body had chosen before my mind caught up. The room welcomed me with its dimness, its thick air clinging to my skin, the bed waiting in the center like a secret. I paused in the doorway, sensing that once I entered fully, something would tilt inside me and never return to balance. She was already there, standing near the window, outlined by the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtain. The line of her back, the curve of her waist, the way her shoulders rose and fell with each breath, they drew me in more powerfully than words ever could. I watched the slow lift of her hand as she brushed her hair back, the movement small but devastating in its grace. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and I realized I was staring with an intensity I couldn't disguise. The room seemed to shrink, pulling me closer to her with every passing second. I crossed the floor with hesitant steps, each one echoing against the silence. The air thickened between us, alive with a tension that neither of us had spoken, but both of us felt. When I came near, I could sense the heat radiating from her body, the subtle scent of her skin mingling with the mustiness of the old house. My hand hovered near her shoulder, trembling with the effort of restraint, until instinct betrayed me, and I let my fingers rest lightly against her arm. The contact was brief, tentative, but it sent a shiver through me that rooted itself deep inside. She turned slightly, her gaze brushing mine, and in that instant the silence grew unbearable. My hands found her waist, my body pulling forward before my mind had time to protest. The softness beneath my palms, the sudden closeness of her breath against my cheek, the heat that surged between us, it was too much to contain. I leaned in, my lips brushing her neck before I even realized what I was doing. The taste of her skin lingered, salt and warmth, and something uniquely hers, and it felt like crossing a boundary I had been circling for far too long. The bed was behind us, its presence magnetic, insistent. We moved toward it without words, as though it had been waiting for this moment as much as we had. The mattress groaned when we fell onto it, our bodies colliding with a mix of urgency and hesitation. Her lips found mine at last, soft at first, testing, then deeper, hungrier, pulling me under like a tide. I felt her hands slide along my sides, fingers pressing through fabric, searching, claiming. Every touch seemed to carve itself into my skin, leaving behind a trail of heat I couldn't resist. I felt the weight of her body against mine, the length of her pressed so perfectly that I couldn't tell where I ended and she began. Her mouth traveled down my throat, leaving a line of fire that made my back arch instinctively. My hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, desperate for more of the sensation that made my mind scatter. She kissed my collarbone, then lower, her breath warm, her tongue tracing circles that made me gasp for air. The sound that escaped me was unrecognizable, raw, pulled from somewhere I didn't know existed. Clothes slipped away in fragments, each piece falling unnoticed to the floor. My skin met hers, and the shock of bare warmth was almost too much. The slide of her body against mine was smooth, intoxicating, the rhythm of her hips pressing into me in waves that blurred thought into sensation. I clung to her, nails raking lightly across her back, pulling her tighter, as though I could fuse us into a single being. Her mouth claimed me, kissed me with a ferocity that was both tender and unrelenting, and I surrendered completely. She shifted lower, her lips exploring the curve of my breast, her tongue teasing until I could barely stand the ache building inside me. I gasped again, arching against her, offering myself to her touch without hesitation. When she took me into her mouth, a cry tore from my throat, uncontrolled, shuddering through the air like a confession. My hands grasped at the sheets, at her shoulders, at anything to anchor me as my body trembled under her devotion. The sensation spiraled higher, sharper, until the edges of the world blurred and all that remained was her mouth, her hands, her body consuming me. The release came like a storm breaking, sudden and overwhelming. I convulsed against her, waves of pleasure coursing through me so intensely I thought I might shatter. My cries filled the room, muffled by the thick air, by the walls that seemed to lean in and listen. I clutched her desperately, nails pressing into her skin, holding her as if letting go meant losing everything. My body trembled with the aftershocks, sweat slick against her warmth, my breath shallow and uneven. When she finally lay beside me, her body curved against mine, the silence felt transformed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with everything we had just unleashed. My skin still burned with the memory of her mouth. My thighs still ached from her touch. My chest still rose and fell with uneven rhythm. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close, burying my face against her hair. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I had found something or lost something, but I knew with certainty that nothing inside me would ever be the same again. The days that followed were thick with a sweetness that should have left me at peace, yet something darker began to coil beneath it. At first, it was only small details I noticed, things I told myself I was imagining. She would slip away to answer her phone, her voice hushed, her back turned, her tone unfamiliar. Sometimes she would come back with a faint smile, the kind of smile that wasn't meant for me. I pretended not to care, but inside, a restlessness began to stir, sharp and insistent, scraping against my chest with every breath. Her absence lingered, even when she was standing in the same room. I watched her eyes flicker to her phone more often than to me, her fingers tracing across the screen with a tenderness I wished she reserved for my skin. At night, when she curled against me, I felt the warmth of her body, but I also felt the distance, an invisible barrier I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I lay awake, my hand pressed against her hip, wondering who else had her attention, who else she imagined when her eyes glazed over. The thought of it burned in me like acid. The nights we spent together grew more intense, almost violent in their urgency. I clung to her, nails dragging across her back, desperate to mark her, to leave proof on her skin that she was mine. She responded in kind, biting at my shoulder, grasping my wrists, pulling me apart with a hunger that felt edged with anger. Each gasp, each moan carried more than desire. It carried struggle, a silent battle between closeness and betrayal. Our bodies collided like storms, and the sheets bore the weight of our turmoil. Pleasure became a weapon, a way to silence the questions I was too afraid to ask. I began to search for signs, for clues that would confirm the gnawing suspicion eating at me. Her clothes sometimes smelled faintly of perfume I didn't own. Her hair would carry the trace of another space, another scent that wasn't mine. I told myself I was paranoid, but the evidence built up in fragments too sharp to ignore. The house itself seemed to hold its breath as I studied her. Every glance a test, every smile dissected, until I found a reason to doubt it. Even her laughter felt different, too bright, too quick, as if rehearsed for someone else. When she left in the mornings, the silence she left behind pressed down on me like a weight. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sheets still tangled with our sweat, and feel emptier than I had before we touched. The memory of her lips and hands, so fresh on my body, would dissolve into bitterness. I replayed her gestures in my mind, comparing them to the way she looked at her phone, the way her voice softened when speaking to unseen others. I wanted to believe that what we shared was unique, sacred, but doubt poisoned every memory, turning sweetness into something sour. My body betrayed my heart, still craving her, even as my thoughts turned against her. I found myself dragging her closer during our moments together, holding her so tightly she gasped for air. I whispered with my hands, begging her skin to confess what her lips refused. Yet each climax left me feeling more hollow, as though I had been trying to fill an endless void. Her eyes, when they met mine afterward, no longer reassured me. They seemed guarded, distant, as if carrying secrets she wasn't willing to share. The jealousy became a living thing inside me, growing each day, fed by every unanswered question. It crawled under my skin, sat in my stomach, pressed into my chest until I could barely breathe. I hated how much I cared, how powerless I felt under its weight. I became hyper-aware of every detail, every call, every unexplained absence, every fleeting shadow in her gaze. The silence between us, once charged with desire, became sharp and hostile, filled with echoes of everything we weren't saying. I tried to convince myself that what I feared wasn't real, that she was still mine, fully, entirely. But even as I held her body, as I felt her skin against mine, I knew something was slipping away. Her heart was drifting, her attention unraveling from me thread by thread, and I was left clutching the frayed edges. I thought about the crack in the wall that first drew me in, and I realized I was now living inside one, a fracture that widened with every touch, every night, every moment of doubt, threatening to swallow everything whole. And yet, even with this knowledge, I couldn't let go. The jealousy consumed me, but so did the need for her. I wanted to destroy what was breaking me and worship it at the same time. Each time she left, I waited for her return, caught between rage and longing. My body ached for her, my mind despised her, and my soul clung to her with a desperation I didn't want to admit. The shadows of jealousy had become my constant companion, and I no longer knew where desire ended and madness began. I returned to the master bedroom as if drawn by an invisible thread, though I told myself it was only curiosity. The door gave a reluctant groan when I pushed it open, and the sound echoed through me like a warning. She was already there, but she wasn't alone. Another woman sat perched on the edge of the bed, her laugh spilling into the air with an ease that felt like intrusion. I froze, unable to move forward, unable to retreat, my body caught in the doorway like prey in a snare. The sight struck harder than I expected. The woman was younger, radiant in a way that burned into my eyes. Her presence too comfortable, too familiar. Her knee brushed against the mattress as if she had been there before, as if she belonged in the space that I had come to think of as mine. I watched her lean closer, and I couldn't look away from the shape of her mouth, curved in amusement, curved in invitation. My chest clenched as I realized how easily that smile could replace mine. My gaze slid to her, the one who had once pressed her lips against my skin, who had whispered without words that I was more than a fleeting shadow. Now she stood by the window, relaxed, composed, her body angled toward the stranger. Her hands moved as she spoke, animated, expressive, the same hands that had once dug into my back with hunger. I recognized every gesture, every tilt of her head, and each recognition stabbed deeper because it wasn't meant for me now. It was being shared freely with someone else. She saw me. That was the worst part. She saw me standing there, and her expression didn't falter. Her eyes locked on mine, and in them I didn't find guilt or apology. I found acknowledgement, an unspoken truth that I was never the only one, that what I thought was singular was just another repetition in a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. The steadiness of her gaze cut me open more brutally than betrayal ever could. It wasn't shame that lived there. It was certainty. The air grew suffocating, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to tear the curtains down, to shatter the mirror that had once reflected the two of us as one. Instead, I stood frozen, my nails biting into my palms, my heartbeat rattling against my ribs like a trapped animal. I felt exposed, humiliated, like the walls themselves were witnesses to my unraveling. The bed, the mirror, the air, all of it conspired to remind me that I was replaceable, that the intimacy I had clung to was not rare, but ordinary. I stepped back slowly, my body moving on instinct while my mind crumbled. Each retreating step was an admission, a surrender to the truth I could no longer avoid. The house seemed to lean closer as I moved down the hallway, its silence mocking me, its shadows whispering that I had been foolish to believe. My throat ached, my chest burned, but no sound escaped me. I left without a word because words would have been too small, too fragile to contain the ruin inside me. Outside, the world was unchanged. The street stretched empty. The trees swayed in a quiet breeze. The sky was a dull and careless blue. But inside me, something had broken in a way that could never be fixed. The crack I had first noticed in the wall of the living room now ran through my chest, splitting me open from the inside. I carried it with me as I walked away, heavy and hollow at once, knowing that the truth was no longer something I could ignore. It was carved into me, permanent, undeniable, and merciless. The silence of my apartment pressed down on me like a second skin. I returned home after that day and found myself unable to move through the rooms the way I used to. Every corner seemed to echo with her presence. Every shadow stretched into the shape of her body. I tried to sit on the couch, but the cushions whispered of her laughter. I tried to sleep in my bed, but the sheets still carried the ghost of her warmth. I realized then that nothing could be washed clean. I began to collect what remained of her in the only way I knew how. I refused to strip the bed or wash the linens. The smell of her skin lingered in the fabric, faint but undeniable, and I clung to it like proof that what we had lived was real. Night after night, I buried my face in the pillows, inhaling deeply until my chest ached, convincing myself that she was still there, pressed against me, breathing the same air. I ignored the way the scent changed, turning stale, then sour, as if love itself had started to rot. It became a ritual, almost sacred. I would come home and slip out of my clothes, lying on the unwashed bed like a worshiper at an altar. My hands would trace the wrinkles in the sheets, following the grooves where our bodies had once pressed together. I would close my eyes and let memory replace reality, feeling the phantom weight of her hips, the imagined brush of her hair against my neck. My body responded as if she were still there, trembling, arching, desperate for the echo of her touch. Pleasure turned into desperation, a loop I couldn't escape. With time, I stopped leaving the apartment for long. The world outside felt irrelevant, hollow compared to the obsession that consumed me within these walls. Food lost its taste, conversations felt meaningless, but the bed remained alive with her residue. I found myself whispering into the silence, not words, but gasps and cries, feeding the fantasy that I hadn't been abandoned, that she hadn't slipped from my grasp into someone else's arms. Each climax left me emptier, but also hungrier, chasing the ghost that had already decayed into nothing more than scent and memory. I started to notice how the sheets clung to me with a damp heaviness, how the fabric had absorbed not just her presence, but my own need. The air grew musty, oppressive, thick with something unnatural. Yet the worse it became, the stronger my craving grew. I buried myself deeper into it, pressing my mouth against the worn fabric, tasting salt and dust, convincing myself it was still her. Shame coiled inside me, but I didn't stop. The shame was part of the ritual, a dark fuel that kept the obsession alive. There were nights I thought about what would happen if she ever walked back through my door. Would she recognize what I had turned into? Would she recoil at the sight of me, tangled in soiled sheets, clinging to what she had discarded? The thought both terrified and aroused me, feeding the contradiction that I could no longer untangle. I wasn't longing for her anymore, not really. I was longing for the residue, the decay, the perverse comfort of her absence made tangible. She had become less of a person and more of a sickness I refused to cure. The truth settled over me with the weight of inevitability. I didn't want her to return. I didn't want her living body, her laughter, or her warmth. I wanted the relics she had left behind, the corrupted fragments of intimacy that clung stubbornly to my space. My love had twisted into something unrecognizable, something grotesque yet irresistible. The sheets had become more than fabric. They were my obsession, my altar, my punishment. I had traded her for her shadow, and in the darkest corners of my mind, I realized I preferred it that way. This was the ending I never imagined, the one that should not have been. Not reconciliation, not healing, but surrender to the grotesque intimacy of memory gone rancid. I became both prisoner and worshiper of what she had abandoned, clinging to decay as if it were salvation. In the quiet of those nights, pressed against the filth of my own obsession, I understood the truth. Love had left me long ago, but desire had stayed behind, curdled and raw, demanding to be fed. And I fed it again and again until there was nothing left of me but the ruin it created.